Hey there, viewers. Here's a question for you. If everything you built was about to come crashing down, how would you handle it? Drop your thoughts in the comments because Diddy just broke down in court after a shocking verdict from the judge. And trust me, this decision changes everything. What went down behind those courtroom doors will leave you speechless. Let's dive in. Chapter 1. The Man Who Still Runs the Room. I've been working at MDeeks long enough to know, when a high-profile inmate walks through those gates, things shift. Some come in broken. Others try to puff their chests, acting like this place can't touch them. But nobody, and I mean nobody, has ever come through these walls and held on to their power like Diddy. From the day he arrived, he wasn't just another inmate. He was a presence. You could feel it in the air. I've seen politicians, cartel leaders, even mob bosses crack under the weight of this place, but not him, not yet. He walked through the processing area like he was still on a red carpet, shoulders squared, head high, like none of this touched him. Even in an orange jumpsuit with shackles around his wrists, the man had an energy, like he was still in control. And for a while, it seemed like he was. Most inmates get a reality check within the first week. You can't fake your way through lockup. But Diddy, he didn't need to fake anything. The minute he stepped into the unit, people moved. Even the guys who thought they ran things around here took a step back. Money talks. It talks louder in prison than anywhere else. And from what I saw, Diddy's money was still working. I don't know how he did it, but he had a way of making things happen. Better food, extra calls, and nobody questioned it. It was like the rules bent around him without anyone saying a word. And trust me, when you've been in this place long enough, you notice when things bend. Inmates talk, always. And the rumors about Diddy? They spread fast. Some said he had guards on his payroll. Others claimed outside connections were still pulling strings. But there was one thing everybody agreed on. He wasn't like the rest of them. I saw it firsthand. Most guys in here either break down or toughen up, but he didn't do either. He stayed. Diddy. Same cold stare. Same quiet arrogance. Like none of this could really touch him. And maybe it couldn't. But here's the thing about power in prison. It only lasts as long as you can hold on to it. And the higher you sit, the harder the fall. I've seen it too many times. No matter how big they are on the outside, sooner or later, this place catches up to them. And lately, I could see it catching up to him. At first, it was subtle. Little things, missed meals, restless nights. He'd sit on the edge of his bunk longer than usual, staring at the wall. And that calm confidence, it started to crack. One time, during a routine check, I caught him pacing his cell. Not the usual bored, restless pacing. This was different. Tight shoulders, shaking hands, like something was eating at him. I'm not saying the guy was scared, not exactly, but there was something underneath it all. And whatever it was getting worse. I remember the day his court date was announced. Word spread through the unit like wildfire. Everyone knew it wasn't just another hearing. This was it, the verdict. And for the first time since he'd arrived, I saw something in Diddy's face I hadn't seen before. Not fear, not anger, something else, a crack in the armor. The night before the hearing, I did my rounds like usual. Most inmates were either asleep or pretending to be. But Diddy, he was sitting on his bunk, head low, hands clasped tight. I should have kept moving. I had no reason to stop, but something about the way he sat there, silent, still, it didn't sit right with me. So I spoke up. "Big day tomorrow?" He didn't even look at me. For a second, I thought he wouldn't answer. But then, without lifting his head, he said something that still sticks with me. "It's not over." His voice was low, almost too quiet to hear, And the way he said it, I believed him. By morning, the whole facility felt different, tighter, heavier. Even the other guards were on edge. And when they came to escort Diddy to the transport van, I noticed something I'd never seen before. His hands were shaking. I don't know what he was expecting that day. Maybe he thought his money would still protect him. Maybe he believed his name was too big to fall. But whatever power he had left, it was running out. And something told me when he walked into that courtroom, he knew it too. He just wasn't ready to face it. Chapter 2. The Day of Reckoning. The morning of Diddy's court hearing felt different. Even for MDC, where tension hangs in the air like a thick fog, this day was heavier. You could feel it in every corner of the facility, from the break room where guards whispered in hushed voices to the cell blocks, where even the most hardened inmates kept a low profile. And right in the middle of it all, Diddy. When I arrived for my shift, the first thing I did was check his cell. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Something about the way he'd been acting lately. It didn't sit right with me. I expected to see a man on edge. After all, today wasn't just another court appearance. This was the day. The kind that could either open the door back to freedom or slam it shut forever. But when I got to his cell, he didn't look anxious. He looked bored. He was sitting on the edge of his bunk, hands resting loosely on his knees, head tilted back against the wall like he was waiting for a meeting to start. For a man facing what could easily be the end of everything he built, you'd think there'd be a crack in that facade. But no. Diddy was still Diddy, untouchable. Or at least, that's what he wanted everyone to believe. I tapped the bars with my baton. "Big day," I said. He glanced at me, barely interested, like I wasn't worth his time. "It's just another room," he muttered. "They talk. I listen. Same old shat." I should have let it slide. Most of us guards didn't engage with inmates unless we had to. But something about his attitude, it got under my skin. "You really think this is nothing?" I asked, leaning closer. "They're not playing with you, man. You know that, right?" His lips curled into a smirk. Not a nervous one, a confident one. "They've been trying to bury me for years," he said, voice smooth and cold. "And I'm still here." He wasn't lying. Through all the headlines, the accusations, the legal battles, he always found a way out. Always. But today felt different. When the transport officers showed up to take him to the courthouse, I followed them down to the loading dock. Usually, inmates facing a high-stakes hearing would shuffle their feet or keep their heads low, but not him. He walked with his chin up, like the world outside still belonged to him. And maybe in his mind, it did. I'll never forget the way he looked climbing into that van. Cool, calm, like he was on his way to a business meeting, not a courtroom where his entire life hung in the balance. And the craziest part? For a second, I almost believed him. The ride to the courthouse was quiet. I wasn't in the van, but I heard from the officers later. He didn't say a word. Just sat there, watching the world through the steel mesh window, like a man who knew this wasn't going to touch him. When he stepped out onto the curb, cameras were already flashing. Press swarmed the building like vultures, and you could hear reporters shouting his name from behind the barricades. He didn't flinch, didn't even blink. If anything, he played to it. Paused just long enough to let the cameras get a good shot, like this was all part of the plan. Inside the courthouse, things were no different. The courtroom was packed. Lawyers, media, spectators. Everybody wanted to see if today was the day Diddy finally fell. But when the guards let him in, shackled and dressed in that plain prison uniform, he still carried himself like he was above all of it. He scanned the room, eyes sharp, calculating. like he was checking to make sure everyone important was watching. And when he spotted the prosecutors, he smiled. Not a friendly smile. The kind of smile that says, "You can't touch me." I've seen a lot of inmates try to fake confidence in front of a judge. Most of them crack within minutes. But Diddy, he didn't just sit there. He owned the room. Every time the prosecution laid out a new charge, he barely reacted. You'd think they were talking about someone else. I've seen men beg, break down in tears, even throw fits of rage. But not him. If he was feeling any kind of fear, he wasn't showing it. And that scared me. What kind of man sits in a courtroom hearing everything they've got against him and doesn't even flinch? Either you're crazy or you know something nobody else does. And with Diddy, it felt like the latter. At one point, the judge asked if he had anything to say. Most guys take that moment to plead, to humanize themselves, to remind the court they're more than just the charges. Not him. He leaned into the microphone smooth as ever and said, "I built empires. This won't break me." You could feel the air shift. The judge didn't like it. You could see it on his face. But even then, Diddy didn't care. He wasn't here to apologize. He was here to win. As the hearing went on, I noticed something else. Whenever a new witness was called, he barely paid attention. He'd glance at them, sure, but most of the time he sat there tapping his fingers against the table, like he was counting the seconds until it was over. Like none of this mattered. But there was one moment, a brief flicker, where I caught something different, when they called the first victim to the stand. She walked in slow, voice shaking, eyes darting toward the defense table. And for the first time, Diddy's posture changed. He didn't slump, didn't break, but he got still. And when she started talking, detailing the things she claimed he'd done, you could see something behind his eyes. Not guilt, not remorse, control. Like he knew exactly how far this could go, and exactly how to stop it. By the time the judge called for a recess, Diddy was still in control. At least that's what he wanted everyone to believe. But I knew better, because when they led him back to the holding area, I saw something nobody else did. For the first time since he walked into MDC, his hands, they were shaking. Chapter 3. The Unseen Evidence. The air inside the courtroom was heavy, thick enough to choke on. You could feel it the second Diddy walked back in after the recess. Whatever swagger he carried earlier was still there, but something had shifted. I could see it in the way his jaw clenched just a little tighter, how his eyes scanned the room a little slower. He wasn't as untouchable as he wanted everyone to believe. And that's when I knew something big was coming. The judge re-entered, his face stony and unreadable. You'd think a man like Diddy, who built an empire on power and control, would be the one running this room. But in that moment, it belonged to the judge. "Let's proceed," the judge said, his voice cutting through the silence. "The prosecution has presented new evidence for review. This evidence, I should note, was not part of the original discovery process. We will now enter it into the record." I watched from the back of the room as Diddy shifted in his seat, his face unreadable. But his hands, those hands that always seemed so steady, so composed, they twitched. A flat-screen monitor flickered to life at the front of the courtroom. The prosecutor, a tall, wiry man who had been relentless since the beginning of this trial, stood with his hands clasped behind his back. "Your Honor," he began, "this evidence was obtained from a confidential source, an individual who, due to the nature of their relationship with the defendant, had direct and unrestricted access." Unrestricted access. The words echoed through the room, bouncing off the walls like a gunshot. Everyone knew what that meant. Someone close to Diddy had turned. When the video started, I expected something subtle, a paper trail, a financial document, maybe even a recording of a phone call. But what I saw, it was worse, much worse. The screen showed a dimly lit room, high ceilings, polished floors, a place that screamed money and power. At first, I wasn't even sure what I was looking at. But then the camera shifted, and there he was, Diddy. He was sitting at the head of a long marble table, wearing a custom suit that probably cost more than my entire year's salary. Next to him sat a young man, no older than 19. He looked nervous, hands trembling as he signed a document. "Do you understand what you're agreeing to?" Diddy's voice cut through the crackling audio. Calm, smooth, dangerous. The young man nodded, but something in his face told me he didn't. Not really. The camera zoomed in on the paper he was signing. I couldn't make out every word, but I caught enough. A non-disclosure agreement. This wasn't just a business deal. This was a cover-up. I glanced back at Diddy, expecting to see his usual cold confidence. But for the first time, he looked rattled. His lips pressed into a thin line, and his eyes, which had been scanning the room all morning, were locked on the screen. He wasn't just watching the video. He was living it again. The video kept rolling. The young man finished signing, and as he slid the paper back across the table, Diddy leaned forward, his voice dropping to a chilling whisper. "You know what happens if you break this, right?" The young man didn't answer. He didn't have to. We all knew. The courtroom was so quiet, I swear I could hear my own heartbeat. But what happened next? That's when everything changed. The video cut to another scene, this time a private suite in what looked like a high-end hotel. The lights were dim, but I could still make out the figures. Diddy was there, and so was the young man. But now there were others, a group of people, faces partially obscured. I won't go into details, but the things happening in that room, they weren't legal. Gas rippled through the courtroom. One of the jurors, a woman who had remained stone-faced through the entire trial, covered her mouth in shock. And Diddy? His hands were gripping the table so tightly his knuckles had turned white. The judge's voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Pause the video." The screen froze on a frame where Diddy stood in the center of the room, his face twisted into something cold and unrecognizable. "Mr. Combs," the judge said, his voice heavy, "do you have anything to say before this evidence is entered into the record?" For a moment, he didn't answer. The room held its breath, waiting for Diddy's next move. But when he finally spoke, his voice was different, tight, strained, like the mask was starting to crack. "This is a violation," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "This video, it's fake, a setup." But no one, not even his lawyers, looked convinced. The prosecutor didn't miss a beat. "Your Honor, this footage was authenticated by independent forensic analysts. There is no evidence of tampering." He turned toward the jury. "This isn't some fabrication. This is who the defendant is when he thinks no one's watching." I glanced back at Diddy. That unshakable confidence was slipping, fast. For the first time since he walked through those courtroom doors, I saw something else in his eyes. Fear. The judge sighed, leaning back in his chair. "This evidence will remain sealed from public release for now, but it is admissible." A murmur swept through the room. This was big. Evidence like this, it changes everything. Diddy's lawyer leaned in, whispering furiously into his ear. But he wasn't listening. His gaze stayed locked on that frozen frame, as if he knew this was the beginning of the end. And then, just when I thought the day couldn't get any more intense, it did. The prosecutor stepped back to the lectern, adjusting his tie. "Your Honor, I have one more piece of evidence to present. This was delivered to our office anonymously 2 days ago." He reached down, pulling a flash drive from a sealed envelope. And the moment Diddy saw it, he flinched. Whatever was on that drive, he didn't want the world to see it. And for the first time since this trial began, I started to wonder if even Diddy knew how far this was about to go. Chapter 4. The Evidence That Changed Everything. I've seen plenty of high-profile cases in my time working at MDC. Celebrities, politicians, crime bosses, you name it. And most of the time, these guys walk in thinking they're untouchable. But Diddy, he wasn't just another high-profile inmate. He carried himself like a man who had the entire system in his pocket. From the guards to the lawyers, to the damn walls around him, he acted like he owned it all. But after that video played in the courtroom, everything changed. When the prosecutor pulled out that flash drive, I saw something I never thought I'd see. Diddy flinched. It was subtle, just a quick, involuntary twitch, but it was there. And in a place like MDC, where perception is everything, that tiny movement spoke volumes. For the first time, he wasn't in control. The judge leaned forward, adjusting his glasses while eyeing the small silver drive in the prosecutor's hand. "Proceed," he said, his voice calm but firm. The courtroom fell silent as the prosecutor slid the drive into a laptop connected to the courtroom's monitor. My stomach twisted. If that last video shook the room, this one was about to blow the roof off. When the screen flickered back to life, the image was dark and grainy at first. It looked like security footage, one of those hidden cameras with a limited field of view. For a few seconds, nothing moved, just a still, quiet room. And then, he walked in. Diddy. But this wasn't the polished, controlled version of him the public knew. There was no tailored suit, no cool composure. He looked raw, agitated, like he was trying to keep a lid on something about to explode. The audio crackled to life, and his voice, usually smooth and calculated, sounded different. "You know what happens if this gets out," he said, pacing the room. "You think they're gonna touch me? You think anyone's got the power to take me down?" I glanced over at Diddy sitting in the defendant's chair. His face was pale. Too pale. For all the power he claimed to hold, he wasn't looking like a man who had everything under control. And as the video played on, it became clear why. The camera angle shifted slightly, and for the first time, we saw who he was talking to. A man sitting in a chair, hands trembling in his lap. I didn't recognize him, but the fear on his face, that was unmistakable. "You stay quiet," Diddy's voice was low, sharp. "And if you forget who you're dealing with, just remember what happened to the last one." That line alone sent a chill through the courtroom. And I wasn't the only one who felt it. I saw jurors exchanging uneasy glances. Even the judge shifted in his seat. But the video wasn't done. The screen cut to another scene, this one darker, more disturbing. It looked like a private club or a back room somewhere. The camera shook slightly, like it had been recorded on a hidden device. Diddy was there again, this time surrounded by people. But he wasn't just another face in the crowd. He was running the show. And the things happening in that room, they weren't legal. I won't go into detail, but it was enough to make the courtroom erupt. Gas filled the air, and one of the jurors, a man who'd been stone-faced through the entire trial, actually stood up and walked out. Whatever Diddy thought he had buried, it was all coming to light. I looked back toward him again, expecting to see that cold indifference he always carried. But what I saw instead, pure panic. His jaw clenched so tight I thought he might break a tooth. His hands curled into fists against the table, and his eyes, Those cold, calculating eyes were locked on the screen, watching his empire unravel one frame at a time. When the video finally stopped, the silence was deafening. No one moved. No one spoke. It was like the whole room was frozen in time, waiting to see what would happen next. The prosecutor didn't miss a beat. "Your Honor," he said, stepping away from the monitor, "this evidence directly ties the defendant to an organized criminal network responsible for coercion, intimidation, and illegal activities that extend far beyond what we previously understood." Diddy's lawyer stood up so fast his chair nearly toppled over. "Objection, Your Honor. This evidence is circumstantial at best and should be inadmissible. My client—" But the judge held up his hand, cutting him off. "Sit down, counsel," he said, his tone cold as ice. "This evidence isn't going anywhere." I don't know if you've ever seen a man realize he's losing everything, but I saw it that day. And for Diddy, that realization was hitting hard. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, like the walls were closing in around him. And maybe they were. The judge turned his attention to Diddy. "Mr. Combs," he said, his voice heavy, "this court will reconvene tomorrow to further examine this evidence. But make no mistake, what we've seen today changes everything." You could almost hear the finality in his words, like a nail being driven into a coffin. As the bailiffs moved to escort Diddy back to holding, something happened that I'll never forget. He turned, just for a second, and looked toward the prosecutor's table. His face was pale, sweat beading on his forehead, but his eyes were burning with rage, like a man who knew he was cornered and was already planning his next move. The courtroom slowly emptied out, whispers echoing off the walls. But even after everyone else had gone, I stayed behind, thinking about everything I'd just seen. Diddy, the man who once seemed larger than life, was falling. But if there's one thing I've learned working in this place, a man like that never goes down quietly. Chapter 5. The horrific truth unfolds. I've seen a lot during my time working at MDC, things that would make most people lose sleep for weeks. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what I saw in that courtroom. The evidence they showed was already enough to shake the entire room. But what came next? It wasn't just disturbing, it was unspeakable. When the judge ordered the next video to be played, there was a hesitation, like even the court staff didn't want to touch it. The prosecutor handed the drive to the bailiff, and I swear his hands were trembling as he slid it into the laptop. And the second the video started, I knew this wasn't something any of us were supposed to see. At first, it looked like another hidden camera recording, dimly lit, grainy. But as the image sharpened, the air in the room changed. The tension became thick, heavy, dangerous. And there he was, Diddy. But this wasn't the music mogul everyone knew, the one who smiled on red carpets and rubbed elbows with the world's elite. This was a man completely unmasked. And what he was doing, I can't even describe it fully. It wasn't just illegal, it was inhuman. The camera captured everything, things no one in that courtroom was prepared to witness. I won't repeat the details here. Some things, they're too dark to speak aloud. But let me tell you this, it wasn't just business. This was something else. I glanced around the courtroom. People were frozen, as if they couldn't believe their own eyes. One of the reporters, a woman who had been taking notes furiously the entire trial, dropped her pen. She didn't even bend down to pick it up. She just sat there, staring. And then there was the jury. Jurors are supposed to stay neutral, professional, even when the evidence is tough to stomach. But this? I saw one man bury his face in his hands. Another juror, an older woman who'd been stone-faced from day one, started shaking her head, like she wanted to deny what she was seeing but couldn't. And Diddy? He wasn't calm anymore. The man who always seemed to be 10 steps ahead, the one who smirked through every testimony and barely flinched when the first video dropped. He was losing it. His jaw tightened. His fingers twitched against the table. And for the first time since he walked into that courtroom, he looked scared. I leaned against the wall, trying to process it all. But the more I watched, the more disturbed I became. This wasn't just a celebrity's downfall. This was something darker. The acts shown in that video, let's just say, they crossed a line no human being should ever cross. And it wasn't just what he did. It was how he did it. Cold, calculated, like he believed nothing and no one could ever touch him. I could feel the shift in the courtroom. The judge's face turned stony, like he was forcing himself to keep composure. Even the prosecutor, a man who'd built his career taking down the most dangerous figures in the city, looked uneasy. And then, the video reached the moment that changed everything. It wasn't just about the crimes. No, this went deeper. In the middle of the video, Diddy was speaking to someone off camera. At first, his voice was calm, too calm. But then, he said something that made the blood drain from my face. "You think they can touch me?" he sneered. "I own them. The judges, the lawyers, the cops, they all work for me. And if anyone forgets that..." He leaned closer to the camera, his face twisted into a chilling smile. "They won't live to tell the story." The entire courtroom felt like it was holding its breath. Those words weren't just arrogant, they were a direct threat. And based on the evidence we'd already seen, it wasn't just a bluff. When the video finally stopped, the silence was deafening. For a moment, no one moved. No one spoke. It was like the entire room was trapped in a nightmare no one could wake up from. And then, out of nowhere, Diddy snapped. He slammed his fists on the table so hard the sound echoed through the room. "This is a setup," he shouted, his voice raw with rage. "You think you can break me? You think you know who you're messing with?" The bailiffs moved in, but for a second it looked like even they were afraid to touch him. I locked eyes with one of them, a rookie guard who had only been at MDC a few months, and I could see the fear plain as day. Diddy wasn't just another inmate to him, he was a threat. And right then, that threat felt very real. The judge pounded his gavel, demanding order, but Diddy wasn't done. He stood up, towering over the table, and his whole body was trembling, not with fear, with rage. "You think this changes anything?" he spat, glaring at the prosecutor. "You're all pawns, every one of you. When this is over, I'll still be standing, and you won't." I could feel it, the shift in the air. For the first time since this trial began, Diddy was losing his grip, and everyone in that courtroom knew it. But beneath that anger, that bluster, there was something else. Fear. And here's the thing about fear. It makes people dangerous. I knew right then and there, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Because a man like Diddy, when he feels the walls closing in, he doesn't break. He fights. And from the look in his eyes, the fight was just beginning.